Hello, everyone. My name is Rosalind O'Connell from Advocacy Solutions, and we are going to get started now with tonight's webinar. Please note that everyone will be muted when they join the webinar. And before we begin the presentation, I'd like to touch on a few housekeeping items. So the webinar is being recorded so that we can archive the presentation on the HAC website and share a link with anyone who was not able to participate today. And since everyone is muted, and in the interest of keeping things organized, we ask that you submit your questions by typing them into the question panel on your on-screen dashboard. We will be holding all questions until the end of the presentation, and we'll do our best to address all of the questions that we get tonight, depending on how many we receive and the time allotted for this webinar. If you have any technical difficulties throughout this webinar, please use the chat icon, also located on your panel on screen. And you can also email my colleague Lauren at advocacysolutions.ca, and she will do her best to answer your email as soon as possible if you're not able to use the chat function. We'll now get started with the webinar. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Oh, hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks everyone for joining in today for our second of 3 webinars focused on advocacy. My name is Anne-Marie Khan. I'm the founder and executive director of Hereditary Amyloidosis Canada. And as a relatively new organisation, we are so pleased to be able to bring this webinar series to our community at this time. But we wouldn't be here today without the individuals and organisations who so generously support our work, including hATTR, Alnylam, Pfizer, and Ryder. And it's a critical time indeed for us to learn about advocacy and how drugs are approved and funded in Canada. Given that we have seen 3 new treatments for hATTR amyloidosis approved in this country just in the past year and a half, one achievement. By the end of this series, our community will be ready to engage in advocacy to ensure that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis are accessible through public funding to all of those who can benefit from them, no matter where they live across the country. But before we begin, I'd like to thank the team from Advocacy Solutions for being with us today. And I will ask Ryan and Joanne to kindly introduce themselves.
I'm Ryan Clark, the founder and president of Advocacy Solutions.
And I'm Joanne Koski, managing director of Advocacy Solutions. And on behalf of our colleagues, Rosalind O'Connell and Lauren Wu, we are so pleased to be joining all of you for this webinar series tonight. And now I'll turn it back over to Ryan to get us started.
So we'll just quickly do welcome and introductions as we're doing now. I'll then walk you through the webinar series objectives, as well as an update on on access to hATTR amyloidosis treatments and a recap of webinar 1. I'll then go into really the bulk of our presentation for this evening around how to tell your personal story. You may recall that we introduced this on the webinar last week for those of you that joined us, and we'll go through it in quite a bit more detail this evening. Then my colleague Joanne will talk about how drugs are approved and funded in Canada, and then we'll conclude with some next steps to taking action and our Q&A period. Okay, the webinar series objectives. For those of you who were on the call last week, you'll recall that we went through these, and we'll go through them again next week, but just very quickly, there are 3 objectives to the webinar series. The first one is to educate the community about advocacy and how drugs are approved and funded in Canada. We're going to get into quite a bit of detail around that latter piece tonight. To empower the community to take action in support of publicly funded access to treatments, and to ensure, as Anne-Marie said, that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis are accessible to all patients who can benefit. An update on access to treatments. Again, we put this slide up last week, so again, just by way of update, 3 treatments have been recently approved in Canada. You can see the 3 of them listed there. The processes that all 3 drugs have gone through will be reviewed in more detail during this webinar. As mentioned during the webinar last week, Anne-Marie and HAC have been engaged in these processes to date and will continue to do so moving forward, including in Quebec through the rare disease group there, RQMO. So you've got 3 drugs at 3 different places in the process, as it were. Tafamidis is the one that is furthest behind. It's currently under consideration for funding in Canada. Onpattro is currently in active pricing negotiations, and as of the last day of last month, pricing negotiations for Tegsedi were concluded between the public drug programs and the manufacturer. But before we get started this evening with the substantive content, just a quick recap of what we talked about last week. For those of you who joined us last week, you'll recall that the discussion focused on advocacy. What is advocacy? Why is it important? The fundamentals of good advocacy. Telling your personal story, we introduced that last week. Many of the concepts that we talked about last week, we are going to go into a lot more detail tonight. Building relationships, and then you'll recall if you joined us, we went through a 5-step plan around developing your advocacy strategy. So with that, let's turn to the first of our 2 main topics for this webinar, an in-depth review of personal stories. This first slide, again, is a recap from last week in which we introduced personal stories as one of the pillars of effective advocacy. There are 2 pillars. The first one's personal stories. The second one, like you saw on the previous slide, is relationships. In a face-to-face meeting or in written communication with a decision maker, your personal story makes your issue come to life. It makes your issue real for the decision maker and provides a point of connection between the 2 of you. If properly developed and delivered, your personal story should fuel the logic of your one ask. You'll recall that we talked about your one ask last week. And it should be emotional. Again, we mentioned this, helping to motivate and guide the decision maker to where you need them to be in order to get what it is that you need. So let's move in now to really a much meatier discussion or conversation about your personal stories. And we always start with the essential elements. And there are 4 basic elements that should be included in the content of all personal stories. And I'll go through them now in a little bit more detail. The first one is your basic personal details. The objective of this first section is to establish basically a jumping off point or a basic picture of who you are and to really convey to the decision maker this construct, if you will, that I'm like you. In other words, you're trying to connect to them as one person to another, or quite frankly, one human being to another. This idea that, you know, I go to work, or I go to school, I have a family, I'm raising my kids, I have a spouse. I mean, just this whole kind of general sort of I'm living a life like you're living a life kind of thing. So again, it's just to establish a kind of a baseline connection with the person to whom you are advocating. Then we go into the facts about your personal situation. This is the point that you transition from having set the stage to the circumstances that have brought you to today. And oftentimes, diagnosis or developing an issue with your health is typically that point, that turning point, which brings you to this moment of why you're here now and why you want to talk about your personal story and you want to talk about the issue, this issue that matters to you. It's also the first opportunity in most personal stories to start to open up about your feelings, which you'll recall from last week, and I just mentioned a moment ago, is critical if you're going to connect to the decision maker, the person you're advocating to. Next, you need to transition from the fact of your diagnosis, for example, to the issue at hand. In other words, if you had a health issue, entered into the healthcare system to have it resolved, and everything went perfectly for you and everyone else with that disease, you presumably wouldn't need to do advocacy because nothing would need to change. So this is where you need to talk about the challenges you've had as it relates to the issue at hand. Again, I spoke about this last week. So if the issue is access to medications, don't focus on the prolonged time to diagnosis, perhaps that is part of your personal story. You can mention it. You can mention all the challenges that you've faced, but you need to focus on the one that is linked to the issue that you're there to resolve, and not dwell on any of the other challenges that you may have had to this point. And lastly, your one ask. What do you need the decision maker to do as a result of what you've just shared with them? Again, Joanne introduced this last week, and now this idea of an ask is kind of back again, or the action that is required. So with those kind of core components, or those sort of 4 overarching sections, if you will, of your personal story, let's talk about how to get started, which is often one of the most challenging pieces that people have in all of this. And the first bullet might sound kind of funny, but you start writing by starting to write. It's like a lot of things in life. The way to start is simply to start. And so we've come up with some strategies to help you kind of get started. And again, I will suggest to you a lot of the stuff that we're going to go through in the next little while is content for your reference. You will have access to the content on these slides, but I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. So I won't necessarily speak to all the content on the slides, but know that you will have access to them and they will be available for your reference. So just some general tips right off the bat. Don't aim for a polished story right away. These getting started strategies are about letting your mind wander through possible versions of your story. That means that you don't even necessarily have to start at the beginning. You can start anywhere. Don't worry about correct spelling, punctuation, or grammar at this stage. It's not important. It's good to keep in mind, though, that you'll be sharing your story with a decision maker eventually, but when you're getting started, write for yourself. Don't write for that ultimate audience. Learn to write what you're thinking and what you deem most important about your story. So one of the first ways to get started is through something called free writing. And again, one or more of these options may work for you, but we're just kind of getting some suggestions to get rolling. Free writing is writing to discover what you're thinking, what you have to say, and in this case, what you want to tell others about your issue. And when you start, just start writing. This is basically just the start writing kind of approach. When you read it again with fresh eyes the next day, look for ideas or sentiments that you've repeated, descriptions, ideas, feelings, etc. that surprise you, and connections between ideas, events, and experiences that you may not have thought about before. So that this is how you sort of get through this idea of free writing from a first sort of attempt to trying to pull it together and trying to clean it up a bit, or in some cases make sense of it, depending on how you've approached it, if you take the free writing tact. Listing is another approach. The process is sort of like making a shopping list. You write down, like it says there, laundry soap, for example, and suddenly you remember that you need to pick up the dry cleaning. You start by listing all of the challenges you've faced since your diagnosis, or this is one way to do it. And in that list, you might discover one that stands out as most relevant to your issue and most powerfully supports, again, your one ask. So other examples of things that might get you started if you're doing a listing approach, the big surprises, pleasant or unpleasant, of your experience living with your condition, or of a loved one that has experienced this. What people most often say to you when you tell them about your diagnosis or condition. List down those things. How your closest friends and family have been affected by your condition. The most helpful things people have done so far in response to your diagnosis or condition, or helpful things that people could do in response to your diagnosis or condition, are both good things to list down to get this process started. And of course, the impact on your life of government inaction or action or policy or whatever it is that is related to your condition. Again, another good way to get started using this approach. Photographs. Photographs can be a great storytelling tool. We all tend to take a lot of photographs now with our phones and that kind of thing. If you're going to use this approach, you need to explain why each photograph is significant, or start to take a moment. If you see a photograph and you go, oh, that's important, well, just write down why it's important. And then try to think about what's happening, or what was happening to you at the time that this photo was taken. How did you feel? If there are others in the photos, how did they feel? And if you don't know, ask them. Are there connections between the photos? And how do these photos represent, what do these photos represent to you? What do they say to you about your diagnosis, challenges you face, and the challenges that have occurred or might occur in your life? Those are some questions that you can ask yourself in order to take this approach and have it be effective. And then finally, asking questions and answering them. You're probably familiar with the journalist's fundamental questions, the whole sort of who, what, when, where, why, how. Well, that's really what this is, but for the purposes of creating a personal story. So just as journalists ask questions that are appropriate to their task, to report what happened, who made it happen, how it happened, that kind of thing, you too can formulate questions that will help you get to your story. And now, of course, you'll also need to answer the questions you pose. So think of it almost as interviewing yourself. You're conducting an interview of yourself in order to create a version of your personal story. Okay, you're stuck. Everybody gets stuck. So some tips to overcome writer's block. Again, I won't go into a lot of it, but take a break. That's a pretty obvious one. Step back, go away from it, come back later. Try a getting started strategy that you haven't used. So if you didn't use the photographs, try using the photograph one. Maybe it'll help you, kind of thing. And also talk it out. Talk out what it is that you're stuck on, and maybe talk to somebody else about it and just say, look, I'm stuck in writing my story, and maybe they can help you kind of get started again. So just a few tips. Rehearsal and reading. I'm going to go through these slides quite quickly, 4 slides in particular, as you can see there, and highlight some key points on each slide. I'm going to mention this for the first time, and I'll mention it again in a moment. We have a how-to guide in addition to these slides that you can use as a reference. We actually have a how-to guide that you will have access to that will take you through all of this content, again, in more detail and sort of on as a step-by-step approach to really help you make sure that you're comfortable in developing your personal story. But now we want to sort of talk about, okay, so you've got your personal story and you want to present it. So as you read it for the first time, or you're reading it out loud, watch for spots in your story where you tend to ad-lib. That is where you improvise and add material that isn't written in your story. It's not that you can't do that, it's just that in most cases that doesn't serve your purpose. We generally tell people to resist the urge to improvise and to add to your written story. If you've taken the time and effort to make sure that all of the content there is important, is relevant, flows properly, all of the components that you want, ad-libbing doesn't usually add value. In fact, it can tend to detract from all of the effort that you've put in. Time yourself. Know that you almost never have more than 5 minutes. We talk about sort of creating a 5-minute version, but in most cases, and that's fine, you should have a 5-minute version, but in most cases, it's more likely a 2 to 3 minute version. So make sure that you adjust the version of your personal story that you want, depending on whatever the circumstances are, and you do that by timing yourself. It's pretty logical. Related to the previous slide, there's no need to memorize your personal story. There are people who feel it's very important to be able to memorize it. For people learning to present their personal stories, especially for the first time, we don't recommend that you memorize it. We suggest that you consider reading it actually word for all of the reasons noted on this slide. This slide really contains the rationale, if you will, behind not memorizing it. Now, if you've told it 100 times, then you probably will have memorized it, in which case that's perfectly fine, because if you've done it that many times, you'll be sure to hit all the highlights, all the points. But when you're just doing it for the first time, or when you're starting out, again, like I said, you've put a lot of effort into this, then we suggest that you're probably better off to read it. It'll probably have a greater impact because all of that content will not be forgotten, and you'll ensure that it gets delivered the way it should be delivered. Stay focused. This sounds easy to do, but it can be challenging if you're advocating to someone, for example, who likes to interrupt or is not a good listener. And so to help you stay focused, as you'll recall last week, we introduced you to something called the 5-minute story challenge. And the 5-minute story challenge is simply, if you can't convey your story effectively in 5 minutes, ask yourself these questions, the questions on this slide, and make the changes needed to tighten it up. Again, you should know that in our experience, almost no one, virtually no one, gets their personal story down to the essential elements delivered in 5 minutes on the first or even the second try. But if you keep trying, you absolutely will get there. And this little challenge slide and the content in our how-to guide will help you do exactly that. So just before we wrap up, or just before I wrap up, all of the content that we've just gone through, including this checklist, as I said, and this checklist is extremely valuable. We've been told, certainly in the feedback we've received, again, is contained in this how-to guide that will be available to you to help you put together your personal story. And so we encourage you to use it, absolutely. And one final slide on personal stories. Again, we showed this one last week. When you're putting together your personal story, you really have two choices. In the final webinar next week, we're going to talk about where and how you can use your personal story with respect to some specific advocacy tools. And that goes irrespective of which version you're telling of your personal story, whether you're telling a summary of your entire personal story as it pertains to the issue at hand, so anywhere from a 2 to 5 minute version, or if you're telling a portion of your story that focuses on 1 or 2 aspects of the issue, and that's often a 1 or 2 minute version of your personal story. But now let's move on to the second section for this evening, which is critical to understanding why this community feels there's a need for advocacy, and that is learning about the processes involved in the approval and reimbursement of drugs in Canada. Joanne?
Thanks, Ryan. So what you see on the slide in front of you is a visual representation of the overall drug approval and reimbursement process in Canada, or rather a series of processes, as you can see. It all begins with an idea that a scientist has, and if all goes well, that idea will eventually make its way, as we say, from bench to bedside. And in this diagram, we've divided a drug's journey really into 4 stages to simplify things. First, research, then on to regulatory review, and then on to health technology assessment before reaching the final stage, which is reimbursement, where we'll be focusing most of our attention tonight. But first, let's discuss the various processes in a bit more detail on the next slide. So we'll start from the top. The regulatory process begins when a manufacturer submits a drug to Health Canada, which then reviews the drug for safety, efficacy, and quality. Then if the drug is granted approval in Canada, that it can be marketed or sold in this country, the maximum or ceiling price it can be sold for is determined by a quasi-judicial body called the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, or PMPRB. Now, some of you may recall hearing about PMPRB over the last year or so in the news, because the guidelines for setting the ceiling price of drugs in Canada have been undergoing some fairly extensive and unpopular changes. So from there, often in parallel with PMPRB, the manufacturer will submit the drug to 2 review processes, which look at cost effectiveness, or in other words, the drug's clinical value to patients compared to its cost. And as you can see on the slide, the 3rd bullet from the bottom, there is one such process for Quebec, province of Quebec, called ENEF, and one for the rest of Canada called CADTH, which operates 2 processes, including one that deals specifically with cancer drugs, and we won't get into that in particular tonight. But both CADTH and ENEF make reimbursement or funding recommendations to the public drug programs that are run by the provinces and territories. So now that we've gone through all of that, let's look in more detail at the last 2 processes on this slide, which deal with reimbursement. So we'll start with CADTH and the Common Drug Review. The Common Drug Review, or CDR, is a process within the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, CADTH, where recommendations are made by something called the Canadian Drug Expert Committee, CDAC, lots of acronyms in this world, based on 3 things: clinical studies, the research, which assess the efficacy and the safety of the drug in question, the therapeutic advantages of that drug versus currently available therapies, assuming there are currently available therapies for that disease, and cost effectiveness versus, again, currently available therapies. Now, it's important to note that patient input is allowed with respect to the CADTH process and ENEF as well, and that comes from patient groups. Unless there is no patient group established for that disease, and then individual patients and caregivers are permitted to provide input. And that is in written form to CDAC for them to review. So importantly, HAC and in fact, the whole hATTR amyloidosis community did provide that type of input into the CADTH and ENEF processes for the review of all of the 3 treatments that we've been talking about in these last 2 webinars. And as you know, all 3 of those drugs received positive recommendations to reimburse with conditions and criteria, which is not uncommon from CADTH and ENEF. So that's good news. And just to note, for anyone who's interested, that there is a public record of all the final recommendations from both CADTH and ENEF posted on their website. And just remember that ENEF is the equivalent process to CADTH in Quebec. Okay, now we'll move on to the next process, which is the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which was established about 10 years ago. And it's also known as PCPA, another acronym to add to your list, which conducts joint provincial and territorial negotiations for brand name drugs in Canada. Now today, all of the provinces, all of the territories, and 3 of the 6 federal drug plans participate in PCPA, as you can see on the slide. But that wasn't always the case, certainly not at the beginning. There were fewer drug plans around the PCPA table, and that's evolved. And another recent change to PCPA, which is reflected on its new website, which is fantastic, easy to navigate, is a new category for drugs under consideration for negotiation. So we can now track that. We can now see which drugs are being considered before they enter into or are denied negotiation. And all drugs coming through CADTH and ENEF in Quebec are now considered by PCPA. So just to continue on for another minute or 2 with PCPA, looking at the PCPA website, you'll see that their mandate, as they state, it is to enhance patient access to clinically relevant and cost-effective drug treatment options. And through the combined negotiating power, and that's important, of all of the drug plans across the multiple provinces and territories. The PCPA objectives are to increase access to clinically effective and cost-effective drug treatment options, achieve consistent and lower drug costs for participating jurisdictions. In a country like ours, reduce duplication of effort and improve the use of resources is very important, as is improved consistency of decisions among participating jurisdictions. We have a big country, healthcare is provided at the provincial level, territorial level, so all of these things are very important. And as a taxpayer, this all sounds like a very good thing. But as a patient, it can often lead to a protracted reimbursement process, which delays treatment from getting to those patients who need it in a timely manner. That can happen, and that's where advocacy may become necessary. So a little bit more about PCPA, and then we'll move on. And as you can see on the left of your screen on this slide, PCPA now keeps 6 lists or status designations, and they appear to be updating these lists on a daily basis or close to daily basis, which is great. So we can stay up to date on what's going on. And you can see that the 3 hATTR drugs that we've been talking about, and as Ryan mentioned before, are at different places in this process. Now, on the right side of your screen is a flow chart depicting the various steps in the PCPA process. And as you can see, there are a few junctures where negotiations may not move forward on a drug. But if they do, the successful conclusion of the PCPA process is something called a letter of intent, just close to the bottom there, which is signed by the manufacturer and some or all of the participating drug plans. Remember, we looked at who sits around the PCPA table on a previous slide. Now, it's important to remember that the outcome of a PCPA negotiation, which is again the signed letter of intent to fund a drug, is not the same as a national agreement to list the product. Those are 2 very different things. And in fact, product listing agreements are the final step in the drug reimbursement process, and they're entered into between the individual jurisdictions and the manufacturer. And you can see them at the very bottom of the right-hand side of your screen in the flowchart. And we'll talk about those product listing agreements in just a minute. But before we do, let's just on the next slide look at an up-to-date snapshot of PCPA's activities since it was formed 10 years ago. And as Ryan mentioned earlier, in the update on access to treatments for hATTR amyloidosis, you can see Onpattro remains in active negotiations from last week with PCPA, and on April 30th, negotiations for Tegsedi were completed with a signed letter of intent. And Tafamidis, Vyndaqel is now under consideration for negotiation. So we can see where all 3 of our drugs that we're following fit in the process. And the last thing I'll say about PCPA is that while there is no formal input process, like there was, we mentioned, for CADTH and for ENES in Quebec, HAC established a relationship by meeting with PCPA, by phone, of course, as soon as it was made public that negotiations had begun for Onpattro and Tegsedi. And Anne-Marie, I know, continues to engage with them on an ongoing basis, and that is called advocacy. So let's move on to the last stage of the overall process, and that is product listing agreements. So as we discussed earlier, once a letter of intent is signed with PCPA, the drug still needs to be funded at the provincial and territorial level. And this is the final and perhaps most critical step in the process to actually bringing drugs to patients who need them. So the provinces and territories have and will continue to have the final word on whether a medication is actually publicly funded. The federal government does the same with their 6 public formularies. You can see them all listed here. And in total, there are an astounding 19 different public formularies in this country, each with their own review and decision-making process when it comes to funding drugs. So let's go back to our timeline one more time, where you can see the window of opportunity, as we're calling it, for advocacy with respect to the 3 drugs awaiting public funding for hATTR amyloidosis. Now, as we mentioned, HAC has already been engaging with PCPA, and 1 drug has made it through that process, but PCPA still remains an advocacy target. If you remember from webinar 1, we talked about who your target is with respect to advocacy for Onpattro and Vyndaqel. Now, if there are unreasonable delays with either of those drugs at PCPA, if the community feels that it's taking too long, the support of individual advocates may be needed. But for now, the most effective place for the hATTR amyloidosis community to focus your efforts really is on the provincial and territorial drug programs to ensure they're aware that it's important to you that these medicines are funded quickly once they come through PCPA. And so next Wednesday, on our final webinar in this series, we'll walk through exactly how you guys can get involved to make sure that all Canadians have swift access to these treatments. So that is all for today. We've covered, again, a lot of ground, but before we take questions, we wanted to let you know that for the final webinar in this series, next Wednesday night, we'll get back to the advocacy tools that we introduced in webinar 1, and you'll learn about the specific tools that HAC is making available already and how and when you can use them to get involved. So until then, here are a few things that you can do in the meantime. So you can visit HAC's website, madhatter.ca/advocacy, to learn about the Stop HATTR Now advocacy campaign. You can, as Ryan described, try developing your personal story by using the how-to guide that we mentioned. And if you would like to get going with that, just let one of us know, or Anne-Marie, and we're happy to send it to you by email. And then thirdly, if you think you might be interested in joining the campaign, then send us an email to Anne-Marie's email address, info@madhatter.ca, with the following details: just simply your name, your province, and a little bit about yourself and your connection to hATTR amyloidosis. So we really hope that between now and then, everyone who is on this call will find a few minutes to check out what the Stop hATTR Now campaign looks like online on the eAdvocacy Hub and what it has to offer. And you're going to see that there's even a few things that you can do quickly and easily, right away to start advocating for this issue if it's important to you. And we'll, of course, walk through that eAdvocacy Hub, Stop HATTR Now, in great detail on next week's webinar. So now I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie, who hopefully can speak with you just and say a few final words before we answer some of your questions.
Thank you very much, John and Ryan, for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. That was certainly a lot of content and a lot of information and lots of those lovely acronyms. This is really important. This is a really important series, and it's focused on empowering our community to take action in advocacy. Just to note that this webinar series is being recorded, and each one will be posted on our website for viewing a little bit later. Keep an eye on our Facebook page for the links to the recording. Hopefully, those of you who missed the first webinar had a chance to watch the recording, but if not, please take the time to do so. And now we do have some time for questions. So I'll pass you back to Rosalind to read out some of the questions that we've received from participants this evening. Over to you, Rosalind.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And just a reminder for everyone participating in this webinar that you can submit your questions by typing them into the question panel on your on-screen dashboard. And that is, again, just as a reminder, you can see that here on screen. So our first question that we've received is, how do I know if my issue can be addressed through advocacy?
Well, typically, we talked a little bit on the last webinar about how to sort of test your issues, sort of a five-step process. And the very first step is actually the answer to that question. It is a matter of sort of putting all of your issues on the table and understanding whether or not, a couple of things, whether or not they can be solved through advocacy, and whether or not you can identify a target. Because sometimes when you're doing advocacy, if you can't figure out to whom to advocate, the actual person who can make the change that you require, then it may be that you can't do advocacy. I had one of those many, many years ago. We were looking at advocating to a particular organizational, very loose organizational structure, and we just couldn't, for whatever reason, we just couldn't find somebody within this very loose organizational structure to advocate, and so we couldn't do it. In terms of what issues don't sort of lend themselves to advocacy, it can really vary. In most cases, if it's a public policy issue, for example, and it is something that government can solve, then you can use advocacy to bring about a change. But in most situations, when there's a struggle to figure out whether or not you can resolve something through advocacy, it's usually because there is no real clarity around how the issue can be resolved. So, for example, you might be able to find some people who are tangentially connected to the issue, but they're not really at the heart of the issue. And there seems to be some confusion as to how the issue can be resolved. This isn't typical, by the way, but it does happen on rare occasions. The other times when you don't or can't resolve an issue through advocacy, or you may not want to, is when you're actually not looking to advocate. In other words, sometimes people do, organizations do awareness campaigns, which is great. You want to make a certain segment of the population aware of your issue, or you want to educate them about your issue. And that's all you want to do, and that's perfectly fine. But if you don't ask them to do something about it, then you haven't really engaged in advocacy. All you've done is made them aware of something and educated them about something. And you may choose to do that. So that would be an issue that you're not seeking to resolve through advocacy, because you're actually not, you don't want people to take action. You just want them to be aware of something. So there aren't many, certainly, public policy issues that can't be resolved through advocacy, but on the rare occasions when it's a combination of not sure who to advocate to, not sure of the circumstances, you can't get clarity around the issue. I know sometimes issues can't be resolved through advocacy when groups of people can't figure out where to start. That's also a very common problem. When you can't agree on a jumping off point, then you can't advocate for anything, because you're kind of stuck at the beginning. That's another reason why sometimes they can't be resolved through advocacy.
Thank you, Ryan. The next question that we have is, will the Stop hATTR advocacy campaign that HAC is conducting, will that also include wild type ATTR patients? Anne Marie, I'm wondering.
Yeah.
My apologies. Can you just repeat that question, Rosalind?
Absolutely. So the question is, will the Stop hATTR advocacy campaign that HAC is conducting, will that also include advocacy for wild type ATTR patients?
The advocacy that we're looking for addresses all types of ATTR, and it would include advocacy for the wild type. A lot of patients that that have been diagnosed with the wild type hATTR on tafamidis or Vyndaqel. So definitely they are included in that. And often patients with wild type, to my knowledge, other issues, other organs that can be involved as well. So the answer to that would be yes.
Great. And our next question, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Our next question is, for caregivers, whose story do you tell, yours or your patients or loved one's story?
Do you want me to answer that one, Rosalind?
Maybe, Ryan, did you want to start off, and then Anne-Marie, absolutely, if you'd like to add?
Yeah, for sure.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful question. The answer is your story. The answer is always your story. So a personal story is about you. Now, when you tell your personal story from your perspective, you of course can include those that are part of the personal story. So if you're a caregiver and you're telling the story from your perspective, of course you're going to make reference to the patient, as we say, in this case, or the person who's directly impacted by a particular condition or that kind of thing. But it's actually your personal story. And so you have to use words like me and my and I and you know, that kind of thing. The person who's directly impacted, they have a different personal story to tell. It's from their perspective. The content and the facts may be very comparable, or should be very comparable, but the perspective, the emotions, all of those things must be yours. Anne-Marie, did you want to add anything, or?
No, I think you've summed that up very nicely, Ryan. Thanks very much. I just wasn't sure who the question was for. No, you've done well there. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. And now our next question is it better to find others who are dealing with the same issue as me, or is it okay to advocate on my own?
Well, there's absolutely strength in numbers, but in some ways it depends on the circumstances. So ideally, everybody who's engaged in any advocacy campaign has what we call a connection to the issue. Now, we use that word connection because we want it to be very broad and very loose. So it doesn't have to be somebody who is directly impacted, but it could be a friend, a neighbor, somebody who you work with, somebody who you know from church. It could be any number of different things, but just somebody who has a connection to the issue. And by the way, a connection could simply be that you're concerned about it, kind of thing, or you come to be concerned about it. And so having as many people as possible who are connected to an issue ideally is what we want. Having said that, though, there are some occasions when there might be an issue that is very, very unique to you and your family, or a given sort of moment in time. I can think of a number of different issues that parents often face as it relates to their children. And it may be that you're really not necessarily looking to bring a whole bunch of people into this. You need to resolve this issue on behalf of your child or with your child. You need to resolve it quickly, and you need to move on. It could be a healthcare issue, it could be an education issue, it could be any number of different things. But it's important, oftentimes in the context of children, to get these things resolved quickly so that you can, again, move on. And so in that particular case, just in the interest of time and simplicity, you may decide, I'm going to do this on my own. I know what I need to do. I know what the issue is. I know who the target is. I know what needs to be done. I'm just going to do this kind of thing. And then ideally you get it done quickly and you don't bring in a whole lot of people. But for larger public policy issues or broadly based issues like the things we're talking about tonight, they really require a number of people to be involved in order to be successful.
Thank you, Ryan. And that looks like that was our final question for this evening. So that concludes our Q&A. If there are other questions that people want us to submit separately, please feel free to do so and to submit those to the info@madhatter.ca email address, and we will do our best to answer them. And now back to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosalind. If anyone has any questions or just wants to connect, please reach out anytime through our website, Facebook pages, email, or by phone, whatever's easiest for you. Since there's no other questions, I will end by saying thank you to all who have joined us today, and we look forward to connecting with you all next week for our third and final webinar in this series. Stay safe and be well, everyone. Good night.